Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for another of our Discover Wildlife evenings. My name is Ian Lloyd. I'm one of the product managers here at Wildlife Worldwide, and this evening I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Garbutt. Hello, Nick.
Good
For
evening,
our,
Ian. Good evening, everyone.
for our Discover Madagascar talk. I'm sure most of you already know Nick, but for anyone that doesn't, he's one of our most experienced tour leaders, an exceptional photographer, and also an author on many books on the wildlife of Madagascar. So this evening, if you have the opportunity to ask questions throughout the talk, please use the Q&A and the chat function to do this. We'll try to get through as many as we can at the end of the talk, but for anyone we can't get through, please also write in by email and we'll get back to you. At the end of the talk, we will also have a poll where there's the opportunity to request a travel plan for Madagascar. I think if you're ready, Nick, I'll hand over to you.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. Once again, good evening, everyone. I seem to have been zipping around in the talks that I've been doing over the last month or so, but in some ways we've saved the best till last. Madagascar has always had a very special place in my heart, and I suppose it's the one destination more than any other that has influenced my career and allowed me to further the sorts of things I enjoy doing. I first went there in 1991. The photograph on the left-hand side of this little montage, and I'd been working in Mauritius on a conservation project at the time, desperate to get across to Madagascar, but I was absolutely broke. So I scrimped and saved 500 quid, spent 200 quid on an return air ticket from Mauritius to Madagascar. Spent 100 quid on film, which I stuffed in my rucksack that you can see me wearing, and then stuffed 200 quid in my back pocket, and off I went to Madagascar for a month and backpacked around, visited 4 national parks, and that was it. I knew where I wanted to spend a lot more time, and it was just such a magical experience. And I've been going back pretty much every year since. COVID obviously got in the way, but the photo on the right is me there with my long-term guide friend Thierry Andriani Antifana. That's me back in November last year. So best part of whatever it is, 23-year span between left-hand side and right-hand side. It's very simple why Madagascar captivated me and captivates virtually everyone that goes there. It is just a place like no other on earth. It's a mini continent, all the cliches. It's a world within a world, etc. It's just so different. You look at a map and think, well, it's going to bear some sort of similarity to Africa, but once you get there, you just realize that it is just completely and utterly different, and what you see and what you experience is really nothing like the African mainland. If anything, it has more of a Southeast Asian feel to it. But certainly as far as the habitats and the wildlife are concerned, it is just like nothing else on Earth. So, for instance, most people would associate baobabs with Africa, where there is a single species. There are 6 species on Madagascar, and there's also 1 in Australia. So it's quite probable that baobabs first evolved in Madagascar. We don't know that, but they're an ancient group, and that may well be the case. But 6 species in Madagascar, 1 in Australia, 1 in Africa. Well, I should say 6 native species, because the 1 in Africa is also found on Madagascar, but was almost certainly taken there by man several thousand years ago. But wherever you look with respect to the wildlife, you find things that you just do not find anywhere else. So 99% of all the reptiles in Madagascar are unique to the island, including 50% of all the world's chameleons, from the largest to the smallest species. Frogs too, as you might expect, are almost totally endemic. 99% of all frogs on Madagascar are unique to the island. And the birds too, less percentage-wise endemism. Birds obviously can fly, and therefore endemic birds on islands tend to be at a lower percentage than land-based animals, but nonetheless, over 60% of the bird species in Madagascar are unique to the island. They're endemic to the island, including 5 families, one of which are the ground rollers. These are short-legged ground rollers, which live in the eastern rainforests. And when you get to mammals, something that I've specialized in during my travels to Madagascar, then you get all the way up to 100% as far as non-flying mammals are concerned. So there are tenrecs, which are little insectivore type creatures. This is a lowland streaked tenrec. There are rodents, but unlike anywhere else, this is Madagascar's largest rodent, the giant jumping rat. And as you can see, it's kind of an amalgamation between a small wallaby and a rabbit. And it's about the size of a small rabbit, but hops around much like a miniature wallaby or kangaroo. Very, very rare, only found in a very small remaining patch of dry deciduous forest in western Madagascar now, but indicative of just how different and how unique virtually everything in Madagascar is. Carnivores. There are no dogs, there are no cats, there are no civets, hyenas, mongooses, anything of that nature. All of the carnivores in Madagascar, of which there are 8 species thereabouts, belong to a family that is unique to Madagascar. They are simply called the Malagasy carnivores. There have been times in the past where it was thought some of them were more related to cats, like this fossa. Others were more related to mongooses or civets, but recent or relatively recent molecular DNA research has shown that actually that's not the case, and they form a very closely knit unit, even though they look very different, and they're all evolved from a single common ancestor. So they're completely different to carnivores elsewhere in the world. The fossa is Madagascar's largest carnivore, an incredible animal, beautiful animal, obviously a little bit cat-like, but also has traits of civets and mongooses and so forth, but most closely, albeit distantly, related to hyenas. But incredibly agile creatures, wonderful climbers and primary hunters of lemurs. And as you can see from this photograph, very, very agile, equally at home on the ground and up in the treetops where they're able to hunt all manner of lemurs, from the very largest down to the smallest, and other things as well. And of course, moving on to the island's most familiar inhabitants, the primates, the lemurs, which again are a group entirely restricted, at least naturally restricted, to Madagascar. There's a huge diversity now. Over 100 different species have been described, some of which are contentious, which I'll touch on a little later on. But nonetheless, the diversity on Madagascar is a greater diversity of primates within a small, relatively small area than any other place on Earth. And from a visitor point of view, one of the things that makes them so intriguing and endearing is that often, if you go to the right locations, you can see a large number of them. They're relatively easy to see, often confiding, and you can see numerous different species within a small area. Ring-tailed lemurs are undoubtedly the most familiar, the most famous of the island's primates. But rather ironically and paradoxically, they're the least typical, atypical. Most of the lemurs are arboreal, they're tree dwellers. Ring-tailed lemurs spend at least 25–30% of their time actually on the ground and foraging on the ground. So in many respects, they're a little more like some baboons, for instance. They also live in the largest groups, over 20 in some instances, whereas most other lemurs are in smaller groups or family units. So despite their popularity and their familiarity, they are actually atypical. As you can see, spend a lot of time on the ground, where they're just as home foraging on the forest floor for various fallen seeds and so forth, but they'll happily cover large areas of open space on the ground, which most other lemurs wouldn't be willing or comfortable doing. obviously an image like this, which I hasten to add is without doubt a composite, given what's been in the news over the last couple of days. These are this is a Vero sifaka doing one of the endearing skipping motions across open space in Barenti in southern Madagascar. And this is one of the most famous sort of images, again, conjured up by Madagascar, although typically most sifakas wouldn't do this sort of behavior because most of them don't live in areas where there's open ground. So although it's familiar, it's not necessarily typical. And if you want an example of the most bizarre of all the lemurs, if not all of the animals in Madagascar, you'd probably be hard pushed to beat the eye, which is a primate, even though it doesn't look like one. When it was first discovered and described, it was thought to be a rodent because it has incisors that grow continuously throughout its life. But its way of living, its behavior is so unlike any other primate. They actually forage most of the time for insect grubs. They're primarily insectivorous and use their huge ears to locate insect grubs moving in rotten wood, and then their chisel-like teeth to gnaw into that rotten wood, and then their amazing digits, which are incredibly thin, to winkle out the grub from beneath the surface of the rotten wood, almost like using a little penknife or something. So they've kind of filled a niche that you could argue is not dissimilar to that filled by woodpeckers in other parts of the world. And woodpeckers are a group of birds that are absent in Madagascar, so you can see why that sort of thing may have evolved. So before I go any further, I probably just need to give you a tiny bit of explanation as to why Madagascar is so different. And you need to wind the clock back a fair few years. Let's go back 500 million years, when, as we understand it, most, if not all, of the great land masses were largely joined together. Pangaea, Gondwanaland, and Madagascar, as you can see, nestled right in the middle. And then gradually over the millennia, from around 180 million years ago, Gondwana started to fragment. And as you can see from this sequence, gradually bits split away. But it wasn't until somewhere between 80 and 90 million years ago, I'll rewind that, about 140 million years ago, Madagascar broke away from what is now Africa. But at that time, India was still attached to Madagascar, as you can see from this schematic. And that chunk of land drifted away from what we now know as Africa, out into the Indian Ocean. And then about 88 million years ago, India broke away and began to drift north and east until it collided with the northern land masses. So Madagascar has effectively been isolated for roughly, as we know it, understand it, 88 million years. And of course, 60 odd million years ago, we had the great mass extinction caused by the asteroid hit. So an awful lot of things on Madagascar would have died out. So from around 60 million years ago, it was largely a blank canvas. And anything that arrived there, certainly any mammal that arrived there, which obviously evolved after the mass extinction, could only have got there by rafting across the water from Africa or wherever, in all likelihood, the African mainland. And as a consequence, very few colonization events have actually taken place. But then once they have taken place, those early colonists diversified and evolved into just the array of peculiar species we see today. So that's a very potted sort of summary as to why everything you find on Madagascar is so different to everywhere else. It's simply because it's been there for so long and evolved in such isolation. Madagascar is the world's oldest island. And not all of Madagascar is the same, in fact, quite different. It's incredibly diverse in terms of habitats, and obviously that has then led to the evolution of lots of different species in different places. So broadly speaking, the eastern side of the island, the right-hand side of the map, is very humid. It receives lots of rainfall coming from the Indian Ocean, and it's very wet. And then the rest of the island, the 3/4 of the island you see on the left-hand side over towards the west, is largely in rain shadow and gradually gets drier and drier. The very driest areas are down in the south and southwest, and the very wettest areas are up in the northeast. So that difference in climate and the differences in topography have allowed a huge range of diversity of habitats to evolve, which has obviously then led to the evolution of incredible diversity of species with different examples of lemurs, reptiles, birds in the rainforest, in the dry deciduous forest on the west, or in the southern forests, which are different still. And I'm going to touch on those as we progress. Now, unashamedly, one of the main reasons for this talk is to introduce you to the Festival of Wildlife trip that we have planned for November 2026. So an awful lot of what I'm going to say relates to locations that we will be visiting during the main festival or the extensions to that festival. But nonetheless, an awful lot of what I'm going to say also relates to other parts of Madagascar as well. So you can imagine on pristine Madagascar, before humans arrived, wherever you came along the coast, you would have encountered a wonderful form of forest. This is along the east coast where it's rainforest, but similarly on the west coast, you would have arrived at a beach and it would have, behind the beach would have been an amazing forest. And you can imagine any early colonist that happened to just by chance arrive on a floating raft of vegetation suddenly arrived in this place, which was just there for the taking and with very little else to compete. Those early colonizing individuals and species just effectively ran amok, and evolution took them off in all sorts of wacky directions, which of course led to what we see today. Sadly, because of the amount of deforestation that's taken place in Madagascar, there are not that many places left where genuine pristine forest comes all the way down to the sea anymore. This is the Maswal Peninsula, which is one of the few places in eastern Madagascar where rainforest actually comes all the way down to the sea still. So most of the best rainforest locations are a little further inland, particularly in some of the moderate mid-elevation forest areas, where rainforest looks a little like this. This particular shot was taken in Andasi Bay Mantadia National Park, which is in the central eastern portion of the island, which is actually going to be the first major location during the Festival of Wildlife in 2 years' time. And if I had to pick a single rainforest reserve as my favorite, and I think as the best as an introduction to Madagascar, it would undoubtedly be Andasi Bay Mantadia, because it has so much variety. It isn't just simply the two main national park areas, one of which is called Alanamozotra, the other is called Mantadia, but in conjunction there are lots of other smaller forest blocks that are administered by community reserve organizations or even private organizations. And in conjunction with one another, they provide a sanctuary for an enormous diversity of species at different elevations, slightly different forest types, which means you have the option when staying in the area in Andasi Bay Mantadia for seeing a greater diversity of rainforest species than you do in any other single location on the island. And that diversity is considerable. From the wackiest invertebrates and insects like this giraffe-necked weevil, this is a male, one of the animals that really epitomizes how wacky so much of Madagascan wildlife can be. This particular species is almost always associated with this particular plant called Diacanthanthera, on which it feeds and on which it lays its eggs. So one of the best ways to find giraffe-necked weevils is to find this plant and then examine every leaf on the plant, and hopefully you'll find one. So as I said, this is a male with the very long necks. Males use their necks to joust with one another and also to help roll these leaves into little cylinders into which a female lays an egg, a single egg. She also will roll the leaves as well, but she lays a single pinhead-sized bright yellow egg inside a rolled up leaf like this. Other spectacular insects that you may see in rainforest areas, particularly in Andasi Bay, are this moon or comet moth. This is a male. And some really unusual plant species, fauna and vegetation. This is one of the endemic orchids belonging to the genus Angraecum, made famous by Charles Darwin, who never actually visited Madagascar. But he was shown an example of this flower, and the nectary, the long projection behind the flower that hangs down, which is obviously where the nectar is stored. That particular nectary is about 25 centimeters long. And when Charles Darwin saw this flower, he said that he predicted that somewhere in Madagascar there was a moth, probably some sort of hawk moth, which had a tongue that length, so it would feed on that nectar and therefore pick up pollen and help pollinate the flower. And at the time, eminent entomologists thought he was crazy and said, there's no way a moth could have a tongue of that length. Some 70 years later, the moth was found and was named Xanthopan morgani predictor in honor of Darwin's prediction. So there you are, there is a moth with a tongue that is that long to pollinate that particular orchid. Frog diversity in all of the rainforest area is incredible, but particularly so in the Andasi Bay area, where there's a greater frog diversity than anywhere else. Lots of little tree frogs. Most of these don't have regular common vernacular names. So yeah, I'll have to use scientific names. This belongs to a genus called Buphis. This belongs to a genus called Guiba mantis. It's a moss mimic. And this is another Buphis, a much larger one, often called a leaf litter frog, Buphis madagascariensis. But these are things that on night walks in Madagascar, particularly in Andasi Bay, you have a good chance of seeing. Reptiles too. There are no venomous snakes in Madagascar, so seeing and being able to view snakes closely is not something that you have to particularly worry about because they're not dangerous. They're not easy to find necessarily, but there are spectacular ones that are relatively placid, and when you find them, often you can get nice pictures. This is a Madagascar tree boa. And of course, I mentioned chameleons, and they are without doubt one of the most celebrated groups on Madagascar, from very small examples like this lance-nosed chameleon, right up to the very largest, like this male Parsons chameleon. And again, Andasi Bay, Mantadia area are some of the very best areas to look for spectacular chameleons like this. Big males like these can be a good 60 centimeters long from the tip of their nose to the tip of their tail. So they're utterly spectacular creatures. And some different ones as well. This is one of the more high elevation species found in one of the peripheral areas to Mantadia. It doesn't, again, I'm afraid, have a common name. It's called Kaluma malthi, but nonetheless a very spectacular creature, particularly the males, as you can see from this shot. Right down to very small ones that live in the leaf litter, the brachisias or leaf chameleons, stump-tailed chameleons, again, relatively common and easy to find. Well, not necessarily easy to find because they're so spectacularly camouflaged, but you have a good chance of finding them both day and when they're active and at night when they're sleeping. But if you want examples of camouflage, of course, you'd have to go an awful long way to beat the leaf-tailed geckos. As a group, they are utterly spectacular. They broadly split into two subgroups. The larger ones tend to mimic tree bark. As you can see here, this is a mossy leaf-tailed gecko, which is plastered against this tree trunk. Here's another one, which is on the right-hand tree trunk. If you look closely, you may be able to make out its head and foot. And they spend the day tightly pressed against the bark of the tree trunk, so their frill of skin that goes all the way around them helps blend their outline into the bark, and they don't throw any sort of shadow which doesn't give their outline away to predators. So they spend the entire day like this and then become active and begin their own sort of activity and foraging at night, when they're often much easier to see and look like this. So this is, again, is a mossy leaf-tailed gecko. So that's by day and that's by night. And these are relatively large geckos, anything from sort of 15 to maybe 18 centimeters for a large adult. But the other main subgroup of leaf-tailed geckos don't mimic tree bark, they mimic shriveled and dead, dying leaves. This is, again, one of the most spectacular and celebrated of that group. It's called the satanic leaf-tailed gecko, has a wonderful scientific name, Uroplatus fantasticus. And again, this is something that, particularly on a night walk, you would really try and spend time to look for. But if you find them during the day, and be quite honest, it's generally the local guides that find them during the day. I might have been traveling to Madagascar for the best part of 25 years or whatever. I could count on one hand the number of times I've actually found unaided one of these things during the day on my own. It's normally the local guides that are incredibly good at finding them that are responsible for that. But as you can imagine, you know, they're utterly spectacular things to see. Maintaining the camouflage theme, I'll just take you through a little bit of the bird life from rainforests and manta deer. All of these things are species that we would have a really good chance of seeing on any trip to Andasi Bay Manta Deer, if you've got a tour booked there, but especially on the Festival of Wildlife, where we'll be devoting time in the various areas to look for all of these different species. If you look down on the forest floor here, you can see a beautifully camouflaged collared nightjar, which again is an endemic species to the rainforests of the island. And in contrast, a rather more brightly coloured kua. This is a subfamily. The kuas are a subfamily related to cuckoos, but a subfamily that's endemic to the island. This is the blue kua, which is actually one of the main predators of leaf-tailed geckos. Another celebrated group of birds on the island are the vangas. Now, if you were to line up all of the vangas on a single branch, which would be impossible because they all live in different parts of the island, but just imagine for one moment you could do that, you'd look at them all and go, there is no way in the world that they're all related to one another, but they are. They are so different, not only in body form, in size, in beak shape, and therefore in the niche that they occupy and exploit, that it's really takes a leap of faith and imagination to imagine that they're all related. But once you examine the DNA, you realize that they actually are all relatively closely related. This is Ward's vanga, that until very recently was regarded as a flycatcher, until someone looked more closely at the DNA and realized that actually it belonged to the same group as the vangas. Another unusual bird that's endemic, another family that's endemic, the cuckoo rollers, or almost endemic, because there is a cuckoo roller that's found on the Comoro Islands, very close to Madagascar. But this is a large bird. This is a male, and they're about 50 centimeters long, but typical of most of the native forest regions, particularly rainforests, but also found in dry forests. And another group of birds that are celebrated particularly by the hardcore birding fraternity, the ground rollers, of which there are just 5 species, 4 of which live in rainforest. This is perhaps the most brightly coloured and spectacular, the pitta-like ground roller. I showed a picture earlier of the short-legged ground roller. In Andasi Bay and Manta Deer, there's also a good chance of seeing the scaly ground roller. And these are forest floor birds that spend most of their time scurrying around in the leaf litter looking for invertebrates and small vertebrates, etc. And they actually make burrows in which they nest, normally in the banks of a stream or something like that. So they excavate a burrow about 1 meter long in which they lay their eggs. And on a night walk, you may get lucky and see some of the smaller endemic rodents. This is a tufted-tailed rat, of which there are numerous species around the various native forests, some endemic to rainforests, some endemic to the dry forests. But there are several. This is a lesser tufted-tailed rat. There are several in the vicinity of Andasi Bay mantadea. Being realistic, you're more likely to catch a glimpse of something like this unless you get lucky. Sometimes in a torch beam, they would sit still for a handful of seconds, but it's unlikely you're going to get really good views of these animals. And even if you do, identifying them down to species level is incredibly difficult in the field. You need really an expert to be able to trap them because so many are so similar. But once in a while, you get a good view like this and even get a chance of a photograph. And of course, tenrecs. I showed you a picture earlier of a small lowland streak tenrec, which again is a species that's possible to encounter in Andasi Bay and Mantadee. So is this species, the greater hedgehog tenrec, which, as you can see, looks incredibly like our own hedgehog and is a very good example of convergent evolution. And carnivores, I've shown you photographs of fossa. Being realistic, the chances of seeing a fossa, particularly in a rainforest area, is very slim. Not impossible, but you've got to be very lucky, chance encounters. But there's a more realistic chance of seeing one or two of the smaller carnivores, the most likely being the ring-tailed Vontsera, which is a day-active species and is probably the most common of all of the native carnivores. But of course, it's the lemurs that really steal the show, particularly in Andasi Bay mantadea, the most famous being the Indri, the largest of the extant living lemurs. A large male Indri can weigh about 10 kilos, and they are just stunning, beautiful, piebald teddy bears. And one of the wonderful things about several of the different forests in the vicinity of Andasi Bay is that there are numerous groups that are really well habituated. So not only can you see them, but you can see them well, you can get relatively close to them, and you have a reasonably good chance, in fact, a very good chance of being in the forest and being close to them when they sing, which is one of their real hallmarks. The song of the Indri is just one of the most sensational sounds in nature. I've likened it in the past to a humpback whale sitting up in a tree. And, obviously seeing Indris like this leaping spectacularly through the canopy is wonderful, but I promise you, listening to them is one of the best experiences you could have anywhere in the world with respect to wildlife. One of the forests we're almost certain to visit or will be visiting during the festival is near to Andasi Bay. It's called Maramisa, where you're able to walk out on this particular ridge. And I've put this shot in simply because even if at the time you're walking out on this ridge, you cannot see an Indri, you're almost certain if you go early in the morning to hear groups of Indri calling, and the whole valley just echoes to their sound as different groups bounce their calls off one another. And it's really is spine tingling. It makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end because it's such a beautiful, haunting, eerie call. And really is one of the sounds that epitomizes Madagascar. And it's incredibly loud. It can carry a good 2-3 kilometers across a valley in a rainforest. So if you're standing within the vicinity, and you can often be within less than 20 meters of the Indri when they do call, it is quite deafening. And Indri live in family groups, an adult pair plus their dependent offspring, which may be 1, 2, even 3 offspring, because they generally only give birth every 2 years. So a family unit can have 2 animals, 3, 4, maybe even 5 animals. And if they all start singing at the same time, it really is quite something. And as I mentioned, you know, there are forests where you have a chance of not only seeing them well, but getting close to them because they're habituated and tolerant. And it really is one of the most magical wildlife experiences anywhere in the world, let alone in Madagascar. Indri, of course, aren't the only lemurs that you can see in the area. One of the other really spectacular species is this beautiful sifaka, the diadem sifaka, which is now relatively easy to see in the main reserve in Andasi Bay, as well as the more distant forests in Mantadia or in Maramisa. There are now habituated groups in the main reserve in Andasi Bay. So seeing these animals and seeing them well is a distinct likelihood. And I mean, the picture says really all you need to know. They're just utterly, utterly beautiful animals. Again, they live in small groups, and at the time of year that the festival's taking place, which is November, any young born that year would be in all likelihood around 4 or 5 months old. So you'd start to see them being particularly active, moving away from their mums for the first time. And obviously that adds another layer of interest and intrigue to the experience, because you're seeing lots more behavior as the infant starts to move away, clamber around independently, and then scurry back to its mum for reassurance. But they are just the most beautiful of creatures. And if I had to pick a single lemur that as the most beautiful, I would undoubtedly go for diadem sifaka. And as you can see from this shot, again, some of the groups are incredibly tolerant. In the main part of the reserve, they were actually extirpated in the late 1960s, early 70s. They were hunted out before the protection was as comprehensive as it is today. But in the last decade, groups have been translocated from adjacent patches of forest that were under threat, that weren't protected, and they've been moved back into the reserve, and they've thrived. And from a handful of individuals, they've bred, and those offspring have bred, and there's now, I think, over 50 in the main reserve. And there are several groups that are very, very tolerant, as you can see from this photo. One or two other species that you may get a chance of seeing: black and white ruffed lemur, harder to see. In Mantadia and Maramisa, you have a good chance, or a reasonable chance, of certainly hearing them. They can often be a little more distant, so you've got to be a bit more energetic to find where they are, but there is a chance. And also, one of the things that makes Madagascar so special as a destination to visit is the fact you can go out at night. So nocturnal lemurs certainly are very much to the fore. This is a dwarf lemur, Crossley's dwarf lemur, which belongs to a group that, all of which actually hibernate. They're the only primates in the world that have to hibernate every year. And this particular one also lives in some very high mountain areas where, would you believe, they bury themselves underground to hibernate. A primate that buries itself underground to hibernate. No other primate in the world does that. There are sportive lemurs that you may see at night, but also can see during the day, because they'll often sit out in front of their tree hole resting. And other more rarer species. This is a hairy-eared dwarf lemur. This particular shot was taken on my last trip. Not a lemur that you would expect to see, but obviously a huge bonus and excitement when you do, because it's quite an unusual sighting. So this is where we'll be staying during the festival. This is Mantadia Lodge, which is a really lovely, relatively new hotel. As you see, very comfortable, and this will be a base while we're in the Andasi Bay area. And then the second half of the festival is over on the west side of the island. If you can see that map just up on the northwest coast, you can probably see Majunga written. And if you go a little further north from that, there's a peninsula, and the second location, Anjajavi, is on that peninsula, which is an absolutely stunning coastal location that you fly into with a beautiful private reserve of western deciduous forest. These are the beach chalets that will form the base for our stay in Anjajavi. And as you can see, it's a really spectacular place to stay. And one of the things that makes it so lovely is not only the quality of the accommodation and the location, but also the proximity of the wildlife. So you can be sitting on the balcony of your chalet, look out, and you'll see this. These are cockerel sifakas, which are only found in northwest Madagascar, and there are numerous groups that have territories very close to Anjajavi Lodge, and you will see them on a daily basis, and they're completely tolerant, as this photo illustrates. So not only can you be sitting on your balcony relaxing, you can be watching the cockerel sifaka doing exactly the same in branches just outside your room. And wherever you go in the forest around the lodge, and you really don't often need to walk more than 200, 300, 400 meters, you have a chance of finding lemurs feeding, doing whatever they do. Again, at the time of year we're going to be there, November, their family groups will have young, so there's lots of opportunities for photographing babies and infants, and for also doing trips up the coast from Anjajavi, where you have a chance of seeing western forests that approach something like how they would have been on pristine Madagascar. So this bit of coastal forest, you can see some of the unique baobabs emerging from the rocks right on the coast. This particular bit of coastline is also one of the last strongholds for one of the rarest birds of prey on the planet, the Madagascar fish eagle. Very good chance of seeing individuals while on boat trips from Anjajavi. But the bird life too, just around the lodge and in the dry deciduous forest in the immediate vicinity, is very good. You're going to almost certainly see magpie robins, crested kuas seen on a daily basis, and even rarer species like crested ibis, which are normally quite shy and difficult to see, but in Anjajavi are often a little more forthcoming. And different vangas. This again is one of the most spectacular of the dry forest vangas, the sickle-billed vanga, and as you can see, uses its amazing bill to probe into holes in bark and underneath bark to extract insects and grubs and so forth. Much like an eye might do, albeit the sickle-billed vanga tends to target much smaller grubs than eye do. Some unusual reptiles, beautiful reptiles, snakes too, are quite possible to see. This is a Madagascar ground boa, and as you can see, beautifully camouflaged in the leaf litter. And other lemurs. I've mentioned the cockerel sifaka. By day, there's a very good chance of seeing common brown lemurs, again, just in and around the lodge. Beautiful species. Again, they're going to have babies at the time of year we're going to be there. And also, back to the sifakas, there are lots of open spaces near the lodge, particularly in the mangrove areas, and it's quite possible to see some of the sifakas bounding over some of these open areas. This, of course, is a Photoshop montage of that individual as it bounded across an open mangrove area between two patches of forest. Some of the nocturnal species, there's different species of sportive lemur that you might see in Anjajavi, different species of mouse lemur, amongst some of the smallest of all primates, and dwarf lemurs again. These too hibernate, not for the same length of time as some of the species that live in the cold mountainous areas, but during the dry time of the year, which is normally May, June through till October, these animals become dormant in response to the dry period and therefore the lack of food. And it's really only in mid-October, late October, that when the first rains fall, that they emerge from hibernation. So again, during the festival, there's a good chance of seeing a species like this, the fat-tailed dwarf lemur, shortly after it's emerged from hibernation. And if you look at this shot, which was taken in November, you can see that its tail is relatively thin. Were you to see this same animal in April or early May, just before it goes into hibernation, that tail would be huge and bulbous and full of fat, and it can store up to 20% of its body weight in fat in its tail, and that is used during that period of hibernation to see it through. The resources are used to see it through hibernation. Back to the ii, your chances of seeing an ii in Anjijavi are negligible, but I mention it simply because it's a species that was hunted to extinction in the forests of Anjijavi at some point in the past, but since Anjijavi became a lodge and a private reserve 20 years ago, more and more of that, just over 20 years ago now, more and more of that forest in the area has been brought into the fold and protected. So the size of the private reserve has increased and is now considerable. And one of the initiatives that is being undertaken and has now started is that iis that live in forests further afield, but forests that are unprotected, are being trapped and translocated back to the forests of Anjijavi where they once occurred, so they can re-establish a population in the forest of Anjijavi. Now, the project is in its infancy. To date, I think only 2 animals have been translocated, but this year the plan is to translocate and reintroduce 4, possibly 6 more individuals. So the hope is over the coming years that a number of additional translocations will take place, boosting the population. Hopefully they will start to breed, and over time a self-sufficient, thriving population of iis will re-establish itself in the forest of Anjijavi. I stress the chances of seeing them now or even in 2 years' time will be very slim, but at least it's very reassuring and gratifying to know that they are there. So that's given you a whistle-stop sort of introduction to the 2 main locations that the festival will be taking in and visiting in November 2026. In addition to the main week and a bit of the festival, there are always optional extensions which can obviously add on further experiences to your trip. And there are 3 of those that have been planned. I'm going to talk in depth about 2 of them. I think Ian will mention the 3rd when he comes back in at the end. I'm going to talk initially about the extension that I'm involved with, which is to the very far north of the island. If you look right up to the northern tip and the town of Antsiranana, there's a little green patch just below that, which is Montagne d'Ombre. And then just below that, there are some red patches of forest you can see, which are the other reserves that we'll be visiting during the extension that I'm involved with. So this is Montagne d'Ombre, which is a little isolated island of rainforest because it's on a mountain top. The surrounding area is very dry, but because Montagne d'Ombre is 1,000 meters higher, it obviously receives and generates a lot more cloud and rainfall than the surrounding areas. So it supports a variety of rainforest in which live various species, some of which you won't see elsewhere. This is a Madagascar pygmy chameleon, which is found in all the native forests of Madagascar, but Montagne d'Ombre is a particularly good place to see them. But there are species that are only found in the northern parts of Madagascar. This is a Sanford's brown lemur, which you can find both in the rainforest areas and in the dry forest areas that we'll visit as well. But if there was one group that I'd have to say really shines in Montagne d'Ombre over and above all the others, it's the reptiles. Not only because so many of them are peculiar to Montagne d'Ombre itself, but because they occur in such relatively high numbers and therefore are relatively easy to see. This is another one of the tiny leaf chameleons or stump-tailed chameleons. This is one of the very smallest reptiles in the world. It's called Brachysia tuberculata. That really doesn't give you an indication of just how small it is, but perhaps that does. But this is something, believe it or not, that you have a very good chance of finding. Again, you have to rely on the local guides, but they know where to look for them, and they're relatively common. So it's almost certain that you would see this tiny little and perfectly formed chameleon. On night walks, there's fantastic chance of seeing different types of leaf-tailed gecko. This is Ebenoi's leaf-tailed gecko, which is one of the shriveled leaf, dead leaf mimics. This is the giant leaf-tailed gecko, the largest of them all, which can be over 30 centimeters in length. Obviously a bark mimic, but stunning creature. Can be found during the day when, of course, they're plastered and beautifully camouflaged against tree trunks, but more often found when they're active at night. This is another giant leaf-tailed gecko, just to show you a little bit of diversity. Moving on from Montandombre, we would then spend a couple of days in a relatively unknown reserve called Andavakura, which it's only become feasible to visit in the relatively recent past, after the construction of this community-run lodge, which is really lovely, beautiful place to stay. And this particular lodge was built with the consent and involvement of the local community. So they're invested in it, and therefore invested in the protection of the forest. And they've done a beautiful job of constructing this really lovely place right on the edge of the forest. You can see here this example of northern dry deciduous, slightly humid forest. But also I've put this shot in just to show you how quickly forest changes to grassland and cultivated areas, some of which is man-created and further established by annual fires, some of which is perhaps due to fluctuations over the millennia in climate. But nonetheless, you can see this stark contrast between forest where lemurs and other endemic species are able to live, and then barren grassland where virtually nothing is able to survive. But it's within these patches of slightly humid but nonetheless deciduous forest, you have a chance of seeing some incredibly unusual creatures. Perhaps the most without doubt, the most spectacular of which is Perrier's black sifaka, which is one of the rarest primates on the planet. There are perhaps no more than 250 of these animals left. Their entire world range is perhaps no more than 300 or 400 square kilometers. If you imagine an area 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers, that's 25 by 25. It's very, very small, where there are patches of forest that remain in which these amazing creatures survive. But the lodge that I've just mentioned, where we'll be staying, was constructed very much with seeing this particular species in mind. And there are a couple of family groups that have been habituated. So within relatively short walk, a couple of kilometers walk of the lodge, you can be in forest where your chances of seeing this particular creature are very good indeed. And because they're habituated, once you've found them, you can really just spend as long as you wish with them. I visited this particular place twice last autumn on tours that I was doing, and we found the sifakas every time we went into the forest, and over the course of several days spent hours with them, which was utterly magical. And obviously just affords you a window into not only seeing something unusual, but just seeing the daily lives of something which is incredibly beautiful. And the fact that it's so rare and so difficult to see under normal circumstances just makes you realize what a privilege it is. So that's obviously one of the real draws and linchpins of the particular extension that I'm involved with, to go and spend time in Andavakura, to to look for this particular lemur. And we'll also spend a couple of days a little further west in another area of deciduous forest, around the massif of Ankarana, which is much better known. The Singi areas of Ankarana, the limestone pinnacle karst areas, which were way back pre the breakup of Madagascar. This was probably a coral reef. So at some point in the past, this would have obviously been under the sea and then has been thrust up and then eroded over the millennia by rainfall and by water courses into these spectacular limestone formations. And in and around this grows deciduous forest in which all sorts of species survive. There are some incredibly unusual birds in these forests, one of which is white-breasted mesite, and mesites are another group that are, there are only 3 species and they're endemic to Madagascar. Different examples of leaf-tailed gecko. This is a Henkel's leaf-tailed gecko. And of course, more lemurs. There are Sanford's lemurs in both where the black sifakas occur and crowned lemurs, and also in Ankarana. So in all of these locations, you have a chance of seeing at least 3 different species of day-active lemur. This is a male crowned lemur that's wandering around, as you can see, on the sharp limestone rocky areas. And as I mentioned, many of these limestone areas have underground rivers and at times which have carved out tunnels and caves and so forth, and then these will collapse and form these great caverns. So they're wonderful places for bats to roost, and Ankarana is one of the most species-rich places on the island to see various types of bat. This is a flying fox, but also straw-coloured fruit bat, which roost in large numbers in Ankarana. More and more, I'm trying to dissuade people from actually going into these caves to see and photograph the bats, simply because obviously putting flashlights on them and flash guns for photographs causes a degree of disturbance. So obviously this is something that ideally we'd like to try and keep to a minimum. So that's an outline of the extension that I'm involved with. I'm just going to finish off by mentioning one of the other extensions, which is going down to the south and southwest portion of the island, an extension I believe Mike Dilger is leading. And this is going to concentrate on the main habitat that I've not yet mentioned, the spiny forest, which I guess if you had to pick a habitat that's different, more different to anywhere else on Earth and so otherworldly, it would be this, dominated in places by trees belonging to the family, the Didieraceae or octopus trees. Lots of amazing water retention, arid adapted species like this giant pachypodium, different species of baobab as well, all in very stark, incredibly dry, hot areas, but still areas that are brimming with wildlife. This is a spiny-backed chameleon, which is only found in these very dry areas. And there are endemic birds that have ranges that are tiny, only in very small areas of spiny forest. This is a long-tailed ground roller. I mentioned the ground rollers earlier, 4 species in rainforest. The 5th species, this one, is only found in a small strip of spiny forest just to the north of the town of Toliara. Long-tailed ground roller, but atifati, which the extension will be visiting, there is an excellent chance of seeing this particular species. You may also get lucky and see one of the other snakes. This is Dumerel's boa, again, a specialist of the dry spiny forest and more arid parts of the island. And different tenrecs too. This is a lesser hedgehog tenrec, smaller equivalent of the greater hedgehog tenrec, but one that's restricted to these drier areas of the south and southwest. And rather unusually for an animal that looks as it does and maybe doesn't seem to be that agile, They are very good climbers, and sometimes you'll find them at night walks actually climbing around in the spiny forest trees. Slightly inland from the spiny forest, the extension will also visit this spectacular national park, Isalu, which, as you can see, is an area of sandstone that's been eroded into wonderful canyon forms and shapes. Lots of endemic plants in this part of the island too, arid adapted. This is one of the locally endemic Pachypodium species, but also lemurs too. I mentioned right at the start how unusual ring-tailed lemurs are because they spend so much time on the ground. Isalu is one of the places you have a chance of seeing them bounding around over the rock formations in large groups. So that's obviously a particular highlight. And I know the extension will also be visiting Anja Reserve, which is just slightly further inland, where ringtails live in forest areas and also come out into cultivated areas on the edge of a village. But also they're a population that lives close to some high mountain areas, so they have particularly luxuriant coats in the Anja area because in the winter it gets very cold, at least by Madagascar standards, at night. So the coats of the ring-tailed lemurs in Anja tend to be really rich and luxuriant, and they're perhaps the most beautiful of all of the ring-tailed lemurs that you might see. Also, on that extension, you'll pass through another area of forest that is akin to western dry deciduous forest. It's a place called Zombitsi, where you might see some unusual endemic birds like this giant kua that's the size of a pheasant wandering around on the forest floor. There's a very locally endemic bird called Apat's tetrarcha, which is only found in the Zombitsi forests. And you might also get lucky and see Verosifaka, which is the sifaka that's mainly found in the dry south and also in some western forests. But in Zombitsi, there's a good chance of seeing them in those forests. And they're equally spectacular acrobats and energetic, and you might get lucky see them leaping around in the forest canopy as well. So just to finish off, I've obviously had a love affair with Madagascar for well over 20 years, and my enthusiasm for the island I don't think has diminished one jot. I still love going back to it. I don't think there's anywhere on Earth that allows you to see wildlife in forested areas so well and so easily. And because you're on foot, you get to experience it in a way that is often impossible when you're watching wildlife in other parts of the world. It's not very often, I admit, that you get to lie on a forest floor and look a fossa in the eye like I'm doing here, but at least it's indicative of the sort of experience that Madagascar serves up on a regular basis. It's not only seeing really unusual species, spectacular species, but you often see them in a really close, intimate, engaging way, but on their terms, which makes the experience for me all the more memorable. I visited Madagascar just about every year from 1991 up until 2019. I think I missed 1 or 2 years within that period. And then, of course, the pandemic got in the way, and I missed going for 3 years. But I wasn't idle at that time because I actually put my time to good use and wrote this. So if you are going to Madagascar, you might want to look it up. Should be available anywhere. And I'm actually currently working on a field version, a sort of cut down version of this, which will be available roughly this time next year. But if you are going to Madagascar, you might wish to ask your local bookshop about that, or you can get in touch with me if you're interested. So on to the Festival of Wildlife. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background. I'm sure some of you may have been on previous festivals. If you haven't, the concept of the festival is rather different to a regular wildlife tour. It's really about celebrating all of the wildlife in whichever location. So it's a concept that has moved around from iconic wildlife location one to another around various parts of the world. And wherever we host it, the idea is that the particular accommodation is taken over in its entirety. So the entire festival group has exclusive use of that place. And not only is it about being in that location to enjoy all the wildlife or as much of it as possible that is on show in the company of various people who have experience in that location or experience in wildlife photography, wildlife art, local conservation, whatever it may be, local experts. It's about enjoying and experiencing that wildlife at the best times. But then when you're back at the lodge, being involved in presentations, in workshops, in various other activities that allow you to indulge your interest in the natural world and engage in that particular location, find out more about that location, and further your interests and skills. So in Madagascar, in 2026, as mentioned, we're splitting it between Andasi Bay and then Anjajavi, and then between the 31st of October and the 11th of November. And then there's the choice of the 3 optional extensions, the 2 of which I've outlined, one to the north that I'm involved with, one down to the south and southwest that Mike Dilger is leading. And then the 3rd extension is up to Nosy Bay. This is rather different, up to Nosy Bay, which is in the northwest. And that's being led by Mark Carwadine. And that's involved in some really spectacular whale watching in the Mozambique Channel, particularly targeting Amura's whale, which is a relatively newly described species. It's a sort of pygmy fin whale. And the waters off Nosy Bay are one of the best places in the world to see this particular species, amongst other cetaceans and marine life. And I think Ian will probably expand a little more on that. So I'm going to pass you back to Ian now, who's got various things to say, and then I think we'll move into the questions. Ian?
Hi, Nick. Thank you so much. That was, yeah, absolutely exceptional. I think your talk highlighted, not only how charismatic the wildlife of Madagascar is, but also just what a joy it is to learn about the fascinating natural histories and life cycles of these species that you're coming across. There's so much to learn and discover. I can imagine every 20 meters you're sort of stopping and learning about something else. So yeah, thank you so much.
You're welcome. I've been, as I've said, going for 20 plus years, and I still go into forests and go, wow, I haven't seen that before, and oh, I haven't seen that behavior before, or whatever. And it happens every time I go. So that sort of boyish enthusiasm still remains.
Brilliant. Great stuff. I'm just going to launch our poll, just get that started. And that should give everyone an option to request a travel plan. As Nick has mentioned, we've got the 3 extensions, and to just add a little more to what Nick said about the extension to the northwest, to the island of Nosy Bay. That's a trip that's really targeting us at the marine life up there. Not only is it sort of giving us fantastic opportunities to see Mora's whale, but also lots of spinner dolphins, pan-tropical spotted dolphins, even false killer whales are possible. But there's also a real plethora of other marine species at that time. There can be very good numbers of whale sharks that we can get in the water with, mobula rays, lots of green turtles. So there's lots of things to see up there. So it adds a lot of variety. Great stuff. Well, we've got lots of questions, Nick, so I'll get started. The first one, probably a good one to start with, is just around best time of year. And I know, there's a few things to sort of say around that. So would you be able to give us an overview?
Yeah, sure. I'll start by saying the time of year you don't want to be in Madagascar is now because it's cyclone season. So I would never advise anyone going to Madagascar between really the beginning of January and the middle of April. That's the time to avoid. Um, from the end of April through until the middle of June is good, particularly for amphibians and reptiles. And if you want to see lemurs courting, it's not really a time that many people go, but if reptiles in particular and amphibians are one of your particular interests, going just after the wet season when the dry forests are still wet will allow you to see a lot more species. Our summer months, which equate to Madagascar's winter, so mid-June through until probably roughly the end of August, are relatively quiet. It tends to be cool. The forests are relatively sedate. Some of the lemurs, as I've mentioned, are hibernating. Birds haven't yet started breeding, so aren't calling. So the forests do have a slightly sort of go slow feel about them. And then really from September onwards until early mid-December is when I'd regard as, all things considered, the peak period for visiting Madagascar. And it's certainly when I've spent most of my time in Madagascar, has been during that period. And I think if you were to look around the various tours that companies, including Wildlife Worldwide, offer, most of them would fall within that quarter. It's good because birds are starting to breed, they're starting to call, they're starting to nest, and therefore are much more visible. Most of the lemurs have given birth and their young are much more visible and starting to be really active. And things just really have a more sort of lively feel about them. You might, in some instances, particularly in the drier forests, find it a little harder to see some reptiles and particularly amphibians because it's a drier time of the year. But on the eastern side, it can rain at any time. So, you know, you could have a deluge at any time and therefore amphibian activity would pick up. So there's never a single time when it's good for everything, but all things considered, you get the biggest bang for your buck, probably September, October, November.
Brilliant. Thanks, Nick. That's really good. Moving on to another one, I'll try and sort of condense this into a couple of questions, really, which is around if you had to sort of choose three of your favorite national parks, what would it be? And sort of if looking at it from a first-time visitor and also from a second-time visitor to Madagascar, how would you sort of recommend, you know, how would people choose where to go, do you
Yeah.
think?
That's not an easy one to answer. I suppose initially I would say if I had to pick one park, it would be Andasi Bay Mantadia. And the fact that every itinerary I have run over the years has always gone there, perhaps gives you a good indication of that, because you can see Indri, which I don't think you can go to Madagascar and not see, particularly on a first trip. And it just gives you the greatest diversity. Thereafter, it's hard to pick, say, two others. What you really need to look at is what species you want to see, because so many species, particularly the well-known lemurs, have relatively tight distributions, and therefore you have to pick specific locations if you want to see certain species. So if you wanted to see ring-tailed lemurs, for instance, you would have to go to one of the 2 or 3 reserves down in the south or southwest where you have a good chance of seeing them. If you wanted to see cockerel sifaka, like on this photograph, you'd really have to go to Anjijavi or Ankarafanska in the northwest. If you want to see red-ruffed lemurs, you have to go to the Maswal Peninsula in the northeast. If you want to see Perrier's black sifaka, you have to go right up to those forests in the very far north. So other than Andasi Bay, it's quite difficult, challenging to pick, say, two other reserves. I suppose the other way to look at it is if you want the greatest breadth, it would be to pick one rainforest, one western dry forest, which would either be Anjajavi, Ankarafansk, or Karindi, and then pick one reserve down in the spiny forest areas where you would have a chance of seeing that habitat and some of the species involved. Lots of tours go to Barenti down in the far south, which is a private reserve, a very small private reserve, which is wonderful for seeing ringtails and seeing sifakas. But because it's so small and is surrounded by a lot of sisal cultivation, doesn't really have what I would call a wild, authentic feel like some of the other reserves. Brilliant for seeing things easily, brilliant for photography, but if you wanted a feel of something more immersive and wild, it wouldn't really fit the bill. So it's not quite as straightforward to answer that question as you might think.
Exactly. Thanks very much for doing that, Nick. Yeah, I hope that's helped people. So we can obviously sort of go through different itineraries and options with people at length, but yeah, it is a difficult one with, being the size of France, and which will lead me on to my next question about transport and sort of getting around Madagascar, particularly sort of on the ground. Are you able to give any bit more detail about sort of how different journeys are undertaken?
Okay. Well, during the course of just about any trip to the island, you're almost certainly going to have to fly internally, because some of the distances involved to get to the various reserves are considerable. So you would always fly in and out of the capital Antananarivo, which is roughly in the center of the island. And then most of the reserves you tend to find are out towards peripheral areas. So you have to sort of imagine like spokes of a wheel, and you're flying out to somewhere on or near the coast, and then from that point driving into a reserve. And obviously how you drive, how far you drive, depends on which reserve you're going to. So any particular tour would involve almost certainly one or two internal flights. Thereafter, road transport would depend again on which reserves you are visiting, because some of them, like Andasi Bay, for instance, you can get to on paved roads in a minibus or a coach. But others require you to travel down rougher dirt tracks or roads that were once paved well but have deteriorated so much they're now terrible, where you need a 4x4. And even going to Andasi Bay now, at times 4x4s are useful because some of the areas peripheral to Andasi Bay are more easily accessed in a 4x4 than in a big bus. So again, not necessarily a straightforward question to answer. One of the most popular itineraries, at least part of the itinerary, is to drive from Antananarivo sequentially south down Route National 7, which is a relatively well-paved road. And as you go down there, you probably stop somewhere like Ranamafana en route, Isalu, head down and all the way down to Toliara, and you will do that over the course of a week, even 10 days. And that's a journey you would probably do in a small bus, and then visit these various places as you went along. Most of the other places around the island at some point would probably require you to use a 4x4 to allow you to access the various places. Even the extension that I'm doing that I mentioned, flying up to the northern tip to Antsiranana, just to drive 30 kilometers to Montandombra. It's on a paved road, but most of the paved road is in such atrocious conditions. It's potholed to hell. that you need a 4x4. You wouldn't do it in a regular vehicle or a bus because it'd just fall apart. So even if you're not going on forest tracks, the roads at times dictate that you need a 4x4. And if you're going to some of the more remote areas where you are going on dirt roads, forested tracks, then obviously a 4x4 is an absolute must.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks, Nick. Another question regarding night walks.
Yep.
What sort of, what kit would you recommend, particularly for night walks?
Um, First and foremost, a good quality head torch. I'm afraid it's something that frustrates me endlessly because I see people who come on trips I do to Madagascar and elsewhere where there are night walk options, and they come with, frankly, piddly little head torches that can barely illuminate their feet, let alone any aspect of the forest. So a head torch with a bit of oomph and a reasonable amount of power, I would say, is definitely worth investing in. From a personal safety point of view, because you need to be able to see where you're putting your feet when you're walking over forested tracks, but also because it then allows you to look into the forest and actually look for things. So that's without doubt something that's crucial. If you're then asking about photographic kit, you would certainly, I would say, always want some sort of macro lens, a 100mm, 105mm macro lens with a flash gun. And if that flash gun if you have the capability to take it off the hot shoe of the camera, either with a lead or because it's radio triggered, so much the better. And I would always have a softbox on the flash gun. So those would be the things over and above anything else I would say are musts for night walks in Madagascar.
Brilliant, thank you. And just on from that, what lenses generally would you recommend for Madagascar? Obviously, considering the day and then different habitats, different subjects.
Yeah. I've chopped and changed the equipment that I take on trips to Madagascar over the years, partly in response to my changing photographic approach, partly in response to the way equipment has advanced. So I now find for the vast majority of the stuff that I do, a 100 to 400 zoom lens fits the bill beautifully. In most places you go, lemurs are well enough habituated that you don't need a lens longer than 400mm, and often you'll be using your lens at considerably less focal length than 400mm, anywhere between 200, 300. But the fact that it's relative 100 to 400, mine's a Nikon, but a Canon equivalent or whatever, is relatively light, means that because you're having to carry all your stuff, that makes it easier. I still carry a tripod whenever I go, even though I now do handhold pictures more than I used to, because we can now use such much higher ISOs, and therefore I can maintain faster shutter speeds, that I do find that I handhold for my photography a lot more than I used to. But I always take a tripod no matter what. So a zoom lens in that sort of range will fit the bill for a lot of lemurs, chameleons, and so forth. A shorter zoom, I take a 24 to 120 or sometimes a 16 to 35, which allows me to do the sorts of shots where you're seeing subject and habitat. But I also find I take quite a lot of macro kit, not for the lemurs, of course, but for the smaller things. And I might take 2 or 3 different macro lenses. But I think if I were to outline just 3 lenses or 3 lens groups, I'd say a 105 macro, something like a 24 to 120, something in that range, and then a 100 to 400. And with those 3 lenses, you would cover the broadest breadth. Only if you were really keen on getting really good bird images would I say a lens more than 400 millimeters is beneficial. So if you're a keen bird photographer, then a 500 or 600 or a zoom taking in that range may stand you in good stead as well. But because I don't specialize in bird stuff, I don't take my long lenses anymore. I do have a small 500, which I sometimes put in, but on the trips I did last autumn to Madagascar, I didn't use it very much, but I take it nonetheless.
Great stuff. That's really useful to know. Thank you. Um, I think we've got time for one more, which is what sort of level of fitness is usually required for typical trips in Madagascar?
Um, Good question, and obviously not necessarily a straightforward one to answer. I suppose I would preface my answer by saying everything you do in Madagascar is on foot. You're walking everywhere in national parks. It's not like being on a safari in Africa where it's vehicle based. So a certain level of fitness is undoubtedly required because you're walking. And some of the reserves, particularly the ones in rainforest areas, are hilly. So you will have to walk uphill and down dale in some instances. As I've mentioned, a lot of the time the lemurs are habituated, so you don't always have to walk far, but you still might have to walk up some steep hills, down some steep slopes. Once you get a little more off the beaten track, then the need to walk does increase at times. When you go over to the western side of the island, the terrain generally is much flatter and the walking is easier in the sense that it's flatter, but the temperatures can get very hot. You're talking high 30s, even up to 40 degrees at times. Obviously, from a wildlife point of view, you concentrate efforts early in the morning when it's cooler and the light's nicer for photography, and then later in the afternoon when it's cooler. So you're not often walking around in the worst heat of the day, but nonetheless, you can't overlook the fact that it does get very warm. And therefore, not only are you walking, but it's very hot. So, all of those things mean no matter where you go in Madagascar, you need a certain capability to get around and a certain level of fitness. There are some locations which would require you to be much fitter. But most of the well-known locations and most of the ones that I've talked about this evening, a reasonable level of fitness is okay. You don't have to be able to run a marathon or anything like that. But certainly if you find walking in any way difficult or challenging, you will find some of the walks in Madagascar may be beyond you.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, really good detail there.
Okay.
I think there's one more slide we've got.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you all for your questions this evening. We will be able to get back to a few more by email. And thank you for listening. We've got our next talk on Thursday, which is the Wildlife of the UK with Mike Dilger. And yeah, I'd like to thank you, Nick, for your fantastic talk this evening.
You're very welcome. Hope everyone's enjoyed it.
Great stuff. Yeah, we've had some wonderful comments in. So yeah, brought back lots of memories for people, and yeah, really inspiring.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great. And thank you for joining us. And yeah, hope to see you again soon.
Good
Good
evening,
evening,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you for joining us.
Thanks. Bye-bye.